Neo: The World Ends With You is the sequel to The World Ends With You on the Nintendo DS, which we reviewed on this channel earlier this year, and so I didn't really get to play the remake before this one on the Switch, which is also why I'm here reviewing this game today, because I'll be honest, I was a bit burned out after I finished that game, and had I played or tried to play the remake, I doubt I would have come back for this one. And as we get into this review, that would have been a big shame, honestly, so let's actually just get into it with the story. Neo takes place a few years after the events of the original game, and now the Reaper games are back on with a new set of characters, and with that, this ends up being a fairly welcoming to newcomers type of game due to that premise or that setup. But with that said, the game also does have a lot of returning characters, which end up being some of the biggest plot points or payoffs, and so I still think that if you're a returning player, this game is actually more targeted towards you, story-wise at least. That being said, if you are a returning player, then I also think that this story is slightly less interesting, as it does follow a lot of similar beats to the original story, but now without that mystery that lingers with the original. That came from, the nature of the Reaper's game and the danger of it. But even if you are a new player, this game also kind of just assumes you know this type of stuff, as I never really saw the characters in this game being overly nervous or scared of the situation they're in, or at least not to the level of the original where there was that legit fear of are we dead or are we going to die kind of thing. But also I admit that a lot of that might just be my perception of it, as I could relate a lot more to that feeling in the original, while of course here I more can brush it off. I think here the overall story does end up being a bit by the numbers and ends up suffering a lot from it, even its stronger bits like the characters and their arcs. While they are probably the strongest parts of the game, they are likable characters, most of them, which can be a challenge when introducing a whole new cast to a pre-established world. But even as lacking as they are, I think they lack in that relatability that the original characters did so well, and that had you feel for them and their situation, which I think once again can just come down to the fact that you can't just pull the same situation on me and expect the same reaction. It's not a bad story, and it's more than enough to carry me through the whole game, but it also felt like a big rethread without what I think are some of the story beats that made the original so great. And also I feel like it does end up being a bit too dependent on the older characters and you recognizing them, as a lot of the plot twists and big plot moments are revolved around them. Also, Reno, our new protagonist, is literally just the same character archetype as Neko, which is whatever. This is honestly the weakest part of the game, and it ain't even bad. So now let's move on to the gameplay. This is an interesting one, of course, as any game that transitions from the 2D to 3D perspective, but that's not just it. Also adapting what was already a very unique gameplay in its medium, and honestly in its own way this one is also very unique as well. And I guess you could say it's somewhat derivative of that original game, as in World Ends With You you controlled multiple characters at the same time, one in the top screen and another on the bottom one on the DS, but here there is only one screen, but you can still control multiple characters at a time, as here characters are bound to single pins, and that pin being bound to a button, and so when you press that button, not only do you use that ability of course, but you also switch control to that character, which I will say it's really fast and seamless. It's a very surreal gameplay experience. Honestly, the camera here is doing such a heavy lifting, as it manages to keep up with all the switching without feeling jarring, and also keep up with all the hectic and flashy gameplay. I did manage to break it at some points, but it was still very impressive that it had a hold up until that point. To understand that, I'm gonna give you an example here. Another character switching action RPG, Final Fantasy VII Remake. It is not like that game. The camera doesn't jump to that character. It's more like the character comes to you and the camera adjusts to it, or sometimes you don't even change and you just see the character doing the attack in the distance because maybe you're using 2 or more attacks at the same time, and this game gets insanely visually busy because of it. And before we go into the other reason that happens, let's just get the basics out of the way. And here basically you can move in the 3D space like any 3D game with the analog. You can jump and dodge, which I'll be honest, this is probably the most useless dodge button due to again the hecticness of the gameplay and all the fast character switching you'll do. But that's the basics. Now let's get into the pins. Much like in the original here, each pin has their own unique ability, but here again the difference in each one is bound to a button, here being the X and Y face buttons and the shoulder and trigger buttons, as a total of 6 different buttons. And mild mechanical spoilers, cover your ears for 10 seconds now if you don't want to hear it, but 6 is also the max amount of pins you'll be able to equip by the end of the game, which early on I thought that 4 was a lot and that it made for a very visually busy game, but I had no idea. Because the thing is, if you want to, you can use them all at the same time. And in fact, you are encouraged to do it in that way sometimes, as comboing enemies will not only deal extra damage, but also raise the percentage level, which allows you to pull a special attack when at 100% or above. Now, I'm not gonna go too in depth into that above because it does only show up fairly deep into the game and I feel like that would be a bit too spoilery, but you can probably imagine how it works. Regardless, continuing the pins here, funny enough, still follows the same type of ability as the originals, despite not being touch based with slashing attacks, projectile attacks, or recover health, which are the most basic ones, but then you can also get fairly creative ones with things like creating tornadoes or swinging a car around against enemies, which this time around there aren't any objects on the field, so these just spawn in, which is an odd decision because the game can do it. There are props in certain fights, but when there are, they're not really used for fighting, they're used more for defense, so I don't know, maybe there is a reason. Or maybe they just wanted to make the power easier to use. It's an idea, I guess. But getting back into it, these attacks actually feel surprisingly similar to the original in its feel. The biggest difference might be the Uber pins here, as these are pins where the buttons they're assigned to are colored gold, and these usually have abilities, and because of it, early on you'll only be able to equip one of them at a time. Of course, this can be changed by the sort of skill tree of this game. It works like a skill tree in which you unlock abilities in it using skill points linearly through a series of branches, but here the branches are made out of characters in the game, and the way they unlock is by meeting certain conditions. These might be completing a certain side mission relating to the character or eating at a restaurant 3 times, or, and this being usually for more important characters, will be through simple progression of the story. Now, what these skills are is also very dependent on the character it's bound to. For example, the one for restaurant owners will usually just be more dishes for their restaurant. Now, on the importance of these restaurants and their food, we'll talk a bit more in a bit. Then for clothing / pin stores, it also follows a very similar idea where it might just give you a special pin or piece of clothing for you to use. And then other ones like the side missions and main missions will be ones that have a bigger impact on the gameplay, these being things like being able to use more than one Uber pin at a time, or being able to use more than one pin with the same button assignment, which is very useful and very powerful, which I just didn't think it was going to be, and that's why I feel like I had to mention that. All I'm saying is, get it for the later bit of the game when you have more characters than you can handle. But anyways, I think from this you can see how a lot of the skills are, a lot more useful than others, and that's fine because at the end of the day, that also reflects on their price, and also this, despite being a skill tree, it doesn't really suffer from that problem that sometimes plagues other games with the same system, where useful skills might be barred off by being too deep in the skill tree behind a lot of other more useless skills. Now let's talk about the experience outside of combat, and also how to enter it, which we can start with that. Basically here, very much like the first game, you press the R button to go into this mode where you can read people's thoughts and also battle against the noise, which is what monsters are called here. And much like the DS game, this is also used to solve some mild puzzles, like introducing thoughts or helping people remembering things, or battle some kind of monster in their head, which has the very obvious allegories there. Very basic stuff that fits with the themes of the games, and it's well done enough that even if I do wish there was more variety this time around, for reference, there aren't all that many side quests, and almost all of them can be done within a couple of minutes each, which to be fair was a problem with the original as well. Also, comparing to the original, the open world is a lot more open. It's not something worth going too much into detail about, but just know that usually you have a lot more freedom to move around compared to the original, which I felt was very linear for most of it. Now, for the more general fights with the noise, you can just have singular fights, but much like its predecessor, you are heavily incentivized to chain battles, as in gathering a certain amount of noise before a battle and then do multiple battles in a row with the same health bar, and the incentive here being increasing the drop rate of pins and rarer pins, which of course you want to make yourself stronger with these better pins, but also because pins are the main source of currency in this game, as you are encouraged to sell all the repeat ones. And one of the great things about this game is honestly just how much more user-friendly it is than the original, as you'll be able to unlock through story, skills and abilities that will just make the game so much more simple and accessible by automating some of the more busy work. Things like sell all repeated pins you have with a single button prompt, or recommending a certain set of pins if you want to change them rather than have to look through all of them to see something that fits, but still letting you do that if that's something you want to do. Another useful thing is the ability to see what the conditions are for a pin evolving, or if they can evolve at all, which once again is another returning feature, but not worth going too much into it, as you really just level pins with PP and you get PP from battles, much like regular XP. The only thing to say here is that in this case, when it asks you to evolve a pin, well, you probably should do it. There's really no reason not to from what I've played, especially since the evolved pins will very much play similarly, if not identically, to the previous one, just being stronger or with an extra ability added to it like burn or poison. So, just do it. Speaking of leveling up though, I will say it is scarily easy to find yourself grinding in this game without even noticing. I would say I found myself in the first few days of in-game time, as the story is divided by days, just grinding to level up my pins and doing a lot of chain battles to the point where I was just kind of very over-leveled for the whole game after the first week, which honestly makes it kind of hard to judge the difficulty of the game because of that. For reference, almost all game I was about 20 levels above the recommended level that will show up in certain missions. And I'm telling you right now that this is coming from someone that usually hates grinding. But because of how, and this sounds crazy to say, but the way the game kind of creates a loop with the pins in a way that it's self-propelling, where you chain to level up your pins faster and then you get more and sometimes better pins, making you want to repeat the process, and during that time you're still leveling up and getting XP, and because of that, by the end of it, being fairly overpowered. Now, what I will say about the difficulty is that while I found it easier than the original game, it is still a challenging game, and I think if I wasn't overleveled, I would have had a tough time, as characters in this game either make barely any damage or hit really hard, and it can feel a bit unfair when the characters are not actively playing with can also take damage, and it's not very feasible to move them all, especially since the only way to switch to a character is to attack with their pin. But I also get that maybe it would be too easy to just run away from any enemy attack And to be fair, it is kind of easy already. It wasn't until very late in the game that I actually have to worry about any sort of dodging or avoiding attacks, but I don't know. Leaving that a bit too much to luck is not really the solution. Final thing I want to say about the difficulty will be about the bosses, which are pretty good and varied, especially towards the end of the game. But I will also say that some of the more boring ones are the ones that are just people, and that might have worked for the DS version, but here in 3D it's almost awkward to fight other people the same size. I think this game lends itself a lot better fighting big giant beasts as boss fights. Regardless, not something too important, but something I felt I had to mention. Another thing I wanted to mention here in the difficulty is though that I found that bosses are easy compared to certain combinations of regular enemies or long chain battles, and that kind of diminishes the tension and fear that they try to sell when engaging these sometimes very important characters or monsters. Now, speaking of the regular enemies, like I said, certain combinations can be absolutely deadly at certain parts of the game, like for example chameleons, which can be invisible and do a lot of damage, mixed in with wolves that move fast and can lock you down, makes for a giant pain in my behind, and I hate them. In terms of enemy variety though, there isn't a huge amount of them, but it does cover most of what you expect to see in this type of game, while also having some variety in the powers that each enemy can have, which is symbolized by their color, which to be honest, it is a bit cheap. It is a cheap way to boost the amount of enemies your game has, but it works, I guess. Final thing I really want to say about the difficulty though is, of course, you can change it from easy, normal and hard, and also ultimate, but that's more of a post game thing, and that being a big part of the game, being able to change this whenever you want, because it also affects the drop rates of pins and their rarity. At the price of course adding to the difficulty, this being a returning feature from the original game. Another one correlating to that is the ability to lower your level, which lowers your health, to raise that drop rate, which also makes you understand a lot more why the game lets you get so overleveled. Also, just quickly here, because I mentioned it, there is a post game, but it basically just allows you to jump from chapter to chapter without losing whatever current gear you have on. Okay, now let's talk about the restaurants and clothing, which both pertain to stats. Starting with restaurants, you have to pick a meal for each one of your characters, and whatever meal you choose will give them permanent stat boost, which is very useful of course, and even adding to that, giving characters foods they enjoy will give them a chance to get a bonus to those stat boosts. Now these stats are the usual, health, attack, defense, but more notably here, style, which then leads us to talk about the clothing of course, working like equipable armor like any other JRPG, giving you stat boosts to the characters wearing it, but the notable thing here is their abilities, which are unlocked by the characters having a certain level of style, which while these abilities are fairly simple, it does add another level of strategy when picking who to wear what, and thankfully any character can wear any piece of clothing, but some clothes do have some certain bonuses for specific characters, which again adds another layer of strategy. But if you don't want to bother with any of it, there is a very quality of life, once again, thing here where you can just automatically equip your characters based on a few criterias, like do I want my character to be attack or defense focus or more just balanced. I would say the only problem here is that the clothes with Mortal Peril ability, which is an ability that puts you with very low health at the beginning of a fight in trade for having a piece of cloth with really high stats and even having an ability that boosts those stats. And of course when the automatic system to equip to your character see these kind of big stats, just chooses it over other more balanced choices. Because I think the system doesn't really understand the idea that Mortal Peril is quite a big disadvantage, and that's just not a trade-off I wanted to make. It is a minor thing, but it did annoy me throughout the game. But I'll also be honest, I didn't expect my problems with this game to be so minor. I honestly really enjoyed the gameplay here a lot. And another thing I really enjoyed was the graphics. Yes, I know, amazing transition, only a middle schooler could think of, but anyways, when translating a game 2D to 3D, a lot can be lost in translation, and there are some questionable things here as we get into it. In the original game, there was a very exaggerated art style to the backgrounds, for example, where they looked curved with the planet or like looking at it through a fisheye lens. And they do try to do that here, but it only kind of works because now in the 3D space it has to adjust itself to your camera and your movement a lot more. And in this world it can be a bit jarring sometimes. Also, the major complaint is that the shadows just aren't as striking, but I also get that both of these decisions were very purposeful ones and compromises that are understandable when bringing the game to a 3D space. And given how much I enjoyed the gameplay, I guess I'm glad they did it, but where the game doesn't let down visually is in the characters. My god, do these characters look good. Obviously, you mostly see them in 2D in the story where they ought to look good, but even in 3D, during the battles they look really good, honestly. I'm surprised how well the designs translate to the 3D world and maintain that style. They are less anorexic now, which for fans of the original might not be the best, but I personally prefer this design. And without a joke, I was very infatuated with these new designs, which I think might have also boosted my liking for the new characters, both good and evil ones. So fair to say I like it despite its compromises to transition to the third dimension, so to say, so I don't say 3D again. Now, soundtrack wise, it's great. It's insanely catchy, very reminiscent of the first game, as well with that punk and pop punk sound of Japanese rock, with even some returning favorites that show up late in the game, as I would say almost as a reward for older fans for getting that far. It's great, and honestly I don't have much bad to say about it, and that's kind of my thoughts on the game. Honestly, this would have been an absolutely amazing game had it had a more interesting story, in my opinion. It's honestly kind of a shame because it feels like it's firing on all cylinders except that one, where it holds a bit too much to the nostalgia for its payoffs. Regardless though, this was a game I enjoyed all the way through, and I would have played it even more, maybe try to 100% it if I had the free time to do it right now. But anyways, Neil, The World Ends With You is getting a 8 out of 10. Same score I gave the original. I would still say the original is a better game overall, and it probably will be remembered as so, if that's something that matters to you, but they're still both 8s. Now, recommendation wise, well, as far as price goes, it is a long game, and I think when a game is over 20 or something hours, it is fairly easy to recommend even at full price if it is good, and I think this one is. If you are a fan of the original, then there is a lot here for you, and if you're not, then I personally think you should play the original first. As I said, a lot of payoffs here, story-wise, are dependent on your knowledge of the original story, but I would say that I think this game is best at its gameplay bit, and so you can still enjoy it if it is your first game in the series. So at the end of the day, as all things, it's up to you to decide how important it is. Regardless of your decision though, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing, liking, and even commenting, all things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye.